Japan took a different path to China because of its geography. The biggest difference was that Japan consisted of islands and lay to the far east, at the very end, or very beginning, of the world. It is made up of 4 different islands. Hokkaido is the furthest north, while Honshu is in the center and is the largest. Shikoku and Kyushu are smaller and lie to the south. It might not seem large, but this is Japan superimposed over the eastern United States. Japan's climate is mostly temperate, and fertile plains to the east influence the development of cities. Some of the most populous are Tokyo, Kyoto, and Osaka. Fertile areas are so valuable here, as most of the islands are mountainous, and like China, only a small percentage is able to be used for farming. The mountains here are also volcanic, which increase soil fertility, but the tectonic plates make Japan prone to earthquakes and tsunamis. Because of Japan's relative isolation, they never felt threatened by the introduction of other cultures, because it was never forced, always voluntary. The Chinese never had this luxury, as they had to fend off invaders from the north for millennia, and had a meshing of cultures, whether they liked it or not. This distinctiveness of their culture goes back to their origin myth. An ancient chronicle recorded in the 700s tells of the formation of Japan by the marriage of the god Izanagi and the goddess Izanami. Izanami then gives birth to the sun goddess Amaterasu. One of Amaterasu's descendants then falls to earth and creates the Japanese civilization. Though emperors throughout Japanese history were never worshipped as gods themselves, they were believed to have descended from the sun goddess. The more historical story of the origins of the Japanese civilization are of course more mundane, but still fascinating nonetheless. The islands of Japan had been occupied for thousands of years after early human migrations, while the sea levels were low enough to walk over. Over time, by the late prehistoric period, a culture called the Jomon emerged. This name comes from the cord-marked patterns on their pottery. Their main survival strategies were hunting, gathering, and fishing. They might also have developed small-scale agriculture. The Jomon period lasted from around 14,000 BCE to around 300 BCE, the last period being called the Final Jomon. It was around this point that migrants from the Korean peninsula began arriving in Japan. These new arrivals introduced wet rice crops to Japan and the Jomon, although some historians claim the Jomon had already had the knowledge. This mix of people and knowledge led to a new period, called the Yayoi period, starting in 300 BCE. The Yayoi primarily lived on Kyushu at first, but slowly migrated northwards, onto Honshu, mixing with, or driving out the Jomon, and those indigenous Japanese who would be known as the Ainu, who still live on the northern island of Hokkaido in the present day. Sources claim that by the turn of the century, the Yayoi were led off their island in the south by a divine warrior, Jimmu, who would become the first Japanese emperor. There is no basis for the existence of an Emperor Jimmu, but the story might be based on real events and a real chieftain. Having settled on the Yamato plain, Japan slowly shifted from a hunter-gatherer society to an agrarian and militarized one. Once settled, the Yayoi set up a tribal social structure, based on clans, called uji. The uji were each ruled by a chieftain, who provided protection in exchange for an annual percentage of the harvest. There was a small aristocratic class, but the majority of the population were rice farmers, or small-scale artisans. At this point, Japan was still very decentralized, but those of the Yamato plain had chosen chieftains who claimed to be descended from the sun goddess. Still, there was nothing like the centralized government seen in other ancient societies like China or Egypt. By the late Yayoi period, Chinese sources tell of massive civil wars in Japan, which they called the Land of War. A precursor to the Yamato state could have been ruled by a mysterious magical queen. Well, at least according to Chinese sources. Records from the 200s tell of a kingdom called Yamatai-koku, ruled by a Queen Himiko. It was said that she used her knowledge of spirit magic to seize the throne. She is not mentioned in any contemporaneous Japanese sources though, and remains semi-mythical. The rise of the Japanese state began with the Yamato period, beginning around 300, consisting of the Kofun and Asuka periods. The Kofun is the earliest recorded period of Japanese history. The Yamato were just one of a number of Yayoi clans in Japan, but began dominating these other chieftains, and expanded to hold sway over most of the archipelago. The name of this period, Kofun, comes from the Japanese term for the megalithic tombs that were built. Many of these had distinctive keyhole-shaped mounds. The largest of these is the Daesan-ryo Kofun, thought to have been built for Emperor Nin-toku, the 16th emperor of Japan. It is part of the Mozu tombs, in the Osaka prefecture. The later part of the Yamato period, the Asuka, saw more influence from the mainland, specifically China. This included the influence of Buddhism. It was first introduced in 538, from the Korean kingdom of Baekje, marking the start of a classical era. The period's name comes from Asuka, the capital city at the time. The Yamato state was still decentralized, and powerful clans often vied for influence over the emperor. Two of these powerful clans were the Mononobe and Soga clans. The Mononobe were Shinto, a religion we will touch on later in this video, while the Soga were devout Buddhists. Once the emperor died in 587, conflict erupted between these two clans. Prince Shotoku, of the Soga, led the pro-Soga army at the Battle of Mount Shigi, defeating the rival clan. The prince attributed his victory to Bishamonten, the Buddhist deity of war, and went on to build Buddhist temples throughout Japan. After the battle, the Soga clan became the influential force behind the next few emperors. Prince Shotoku became regent, serving under Empress Suiko, and in the 600s, attempted to centralize the government, based on a model like that of China. Perhaps a unified Japan was finally a possibility. He established the 12-rank and cap system in government, in which officials wore silk caps with a colored feather denoting their rank, and the 17-article constitution, which, unlike modern constitutions, was targeted towards keeping court and government officials in line with Buddhist and Confucian morals and values. Prince Shotoku's main objective was to keep the government and nobility in check, while allowing the state to become more centralized through the emperor. Once Shotoku died, members of the Soga clan had begun to assert themselves more in imperial affairs, and so, a young courtier, a junior member of the Soga clan, and the young son of the empress, conspired in secret to assassinate the clan heads of the Soga. Though the attempt nearly failed, one of the heads was killed during a court ceremony, and once his father heard of his son's death, committed suicide by self-immolation, ending the influence of the Soga clan, for good. The assassination was known as the Ishii incident. In 645, the new emperor, Kotaku, brought in an era of great reforms, called the Taika reforms. The goals were to centralize more power, and keep control in the hands of the emperor and his court. Land was nationalized, and taxes regulated, civil service examinations adopted, and the absolute authority of the emperor was established. Envoys were sent to China, in order to improve the Japanese centralized structure. After the death of Prince Shotoku, and the decline in the influence of the Mononobe and Soga, a new clan began to come to prominence. This was the Fujiwara, who had been involved in plotting the Ishii incident, and married into positions of prominence. By 710, a new capital was built at Nara, beginning the next period of classical Japan. The city was modeled in the same style as the Tang capital of Chang'an. The biggest difference between the Japanese and Chinese rulers was that the Japanese emperor was always considered as being descended from the sun goddess, but in China, he who ruled only needed the mandate of heaven. Another major distinction were the civil service examinations. Japan adopted these as well, but unlike China, which was a system theoretically based on merit, in Japan, only those of noble birth could take the exams. The Nara period also gives us the two oldest books written in Japan. The Kojiki and Nihon Shoki are the oldest, most complete works, chronicling the fantastical and semi-mythical history of ancient Japan. The Nara period didn't even last 100 years, and by 794, the emperor moved the capital to nearby Heian, location of present-day Kyoto, marking the final era in the Japanese classical age. The move was made to have a fresh start away from corruption and Buddhist influences. No Buddhist temples were allowed in the central part of the city. Japan was to stop the envoys to China and develop a flourishing culture of its own, apart from Chinese influence. While we mentioned the first known printed book last episode, Japan produced one of the first novels around year 1000, by Lady Murasaki. Living in the cultural florescence of the Heian period, she took to the Chinese classics, despite women traditionally being excluded from this learning. Women also seem to appear quite frequently with men in scroll paintings, giving the appearance of a more egalitarian society compared to other medieval cultures. By this time, the Fujiwara clan had amassed even more power, and a senior member of the clan was the de facto head of government. The move away from the China model brought with it a return to decentralization. Taxes imposed on rice fields failed, and powerful rural families held onto their own tax-exempt private properties, called shon. As the Heian government lost more power, local lords became the driving forces in society. To protect their properties, they began hiring private soldiers, and a new warrior class would emerge. The samurai. The samurai were expected to have impartial loyalty for their lord. This was similar to the knight class in the European Middle Ages, a period we'll get to next episode, so be sure to subscribe. Instead of a bulky lance and shield though, the samurai's favorite weapon was the sword. Though they had the choice of many sizes, the katana is the most well-known of these. Bows and arrows were also common. They lived their life by the way of the warrior, called bushido. Japan became embroiled in destructive civil war, while in the distance, the tears of the kingdom slowly mixed with the puddles of blood of the dead classical era. This was now the age of samurai. The Japanese feudal age was here. By 1185, Minamoto no Yoritomo, a powerful aristocrat from a warrior clan, defeated his rivals, and set up a power center on the Kamakura Peninsula, to the south of modern-day Tokyo. He created what was called a bakufu, or tent government, referring to the tents where his soldiers camped. The emperor declared Minamoto no Yoritomo the first shogun, a term denoting a general or military dictator. This new political system was called the shogunate system, in which the emperor ruled in name only, but it was the shogun who held true power. Through marriage to Minamoto no Yoritomo, the Hojo clan became regents of the bakufu after his death. Though they were newly founded, they had a link to the past, as an offshoot of one of the major clans of the Heian period. The system worked well, as the shogunate also dealt with keeping smaller lords in check. But they would soon come to face a menace that was unfamiliar. This was a threat that overran most of Asia, and conquered all of China. The Mongols were at the door. Check out our previous episode to see how the Mongols rose to prominence. In 1266, Kublai Khan, new emperor of the Mongols, commanded tribute from Japan, but they refused. The Mongols invaded in both 1274 and 1281, but the Japanese mobilized their entire military to fend them off. The first attempt saw the Mongols attack with up to 900 ships, but the gods acted as windwaker, and a monstrous typhoon destroyed the Mongol fleet. In the second attempt, the Mongols returned with even more men, some estimates as high as 140,000, the largest naval invasion in history at the time, but stayed afloat for months, searching for a place to land. And once again, the winds awoke from slumber. These divine winds, called kamikaze, destroyed half the Mongol ships, and those who made it onto land found the Japanese ready to take their weary souls. It was a decisive victory that ended the Mongol expansion in the east, and left Japan free of foreign invaders for centuries. Though the Kamakura shogunate defended Japan, the mobilization efforts put a financial strain on them, and their phantom hourglass reached its end. Emperor Go-Daigo launched a rebellion, hoping to eliminate the Kamakura and restore centralized power to the imperial court. In the Genko War, a coalition of powerful clans overthrew the Kamakura, and after centuries, imperial power was finally restored. This was called the Kenmu Restoration. But it wasn't to last. Ashikaga Tokoji, who was instrumental in the Kamakura's demise, wanted to be appointed new shogun, but the emperor refused. So Ashikaga rebelled, forcing the emperor to flee and set up another imperial court in the south, while a new emperor appointed Ashikaga shogun. The Ashikaga set up their own shogunate at the Muromachi district in Kyoto, but didn't hold much power at first. There was now a southern and northern court, each with an emperor, and landed aristocracy had amassed unprecedented power. Nobles were now called daimyo, meaning great names, and controlled large tracts of land, all tax-exempt. The lands that had been nationalized, all reverted to become private. With the increased decentralization, the samurai became more important, and power fell to the clans with the best warriors. By the end of the medieval period, in the mid-1400s, a massive civil war broke out, brought on by controversy during a succession struggle in the Ashikaga shogunate. This conflict was known as the Onin War, or upheaval of Onin. For 10 long years, this war between clans raged. By the end, in 1477, Kyoto lay almost entirely destroyed, the shogunate's power greatly diminished. With the military government's strength completely depleted, it was replaced by the breath of the wild, as the daimyo seized control over vast amounts of territory. This brought in a period of warring states, called Sengoku, similar to the period of decentralized warring states during the Zhou period in ancient China. During the upheaval, groups of peasant warriors from Iga province and nearby Koga district banded together to form an Ikki, an alliance or confederacy of defense. There, on the plains nestled by secluded mountains, they trained in secret, refining an older technique which came to be known as ninjutsu. This style was based not on brute strength, but on subversion and spying. Soon, they would become paid agents of daimyo, called shinobi, and were used as mercenaries, primarily to spy. Terms differed for each region, but today we collectively call these ninja. They obtained peak physical performance, which made it look like their feats were supernatural. The climbing of the wall, the sudden disappearances, and high endurance made them seem magical. The blinding powder used in their escape was called metsubishi, which was kept in an eggshell. A misconception is that they were mainly expert assassins, and while they did administer poison and lurk in the shadows, their primary role was the gathering of information. Despite this, they trained extensively in the use of special weaponry like blowguns, kusarigama, and of course, the katana. Japan would remain locked in war for decades, and it wasn't until the next century that Japan would start to become unified. Daily life in Japan remains somewhat a mystery, but one of the first descriptions comes from China, depicting it as an agrarian society based on the cultivation of wet rice. The rest of the Japanese peasants lived fairly normal lives, and changed very little. Most were farmers, but few of these owned the land they worked. Land was either the property of their local lords, or during times of more centralization, the state. Buddhist monasteries also came to control large swaths of land. Some peasants rose to become local officials, who organized the village labor and collected taxes for the lord or state. In exchange, these peasants would be tax-exempt. Most peasants gave these officials their grain as a tax, but sometimes they were unable to pay. Those who couldn't pay were dropped to the lowest rank, called genin, or low person. These were landless laborers, and had to become household servants. Even below genin were the eta, a class of hereditary slaves. They were considered untouchable and lived in separate villages, working the jobs that were associated with defilement, like executioners, undertakers, and slaughterhouse workers. It's possible they could have been descended from a slave class, criminal class, or mountain folk. The Eta still exist in the present day, although the name is considered derogatory. Most of the Japanese population lived in small villages, usually in small houses of wood or mud, and their diet was mainly made up of rice, but also wild grasses, fish, and birds. While polygyny, the taking of more than one wife, was common, with nobles having 4 or 5 wives, and even commoners with 2 or 3, women were still regarded highly in Japanese society. Women were guaranteed inheritance rights, and wives could file for divorce and remarry under certain conditions. Japan also had numerous female emperors, both legendary and historical. Once Buddhism came to Japan, hierarchies became more highlighted, as women were not permitted to become monks unless their husbands died, nor to visit the holy sites. Some even interpreted the Buddhist doctrine as viewing women as inherently sinful, while others kept a more egalitarian view. It took time, but by the feudal period, women were eventually given the same rights as men to participate in Buddhist practices. Religion in Japan began with animist beliefs, and the worship of spirits in the natural world. These spirits were called kami, and were thought to live all around them, in tall trees, the rapid rivers, and majestic mountains. This belief system became known as Shinto, meaning the sacred way or way of the gods, and is still practiced in the present day. Though we don't have records of the origins of this religion, we know the kami was worshipped at least as far back as the Yayoi period. There is little importance placed on moral values or ethical standards, and more so stresses the importance and beauty of nature. Kami are worshipped both in private, at kamidana, household shrines, and in public, at more general jinja shrines. Over time, the early Japanese incorporated the beliefs into an official state doctrine, and a national shrine was built at Ise, where the emperor would go to pay tribute to the sun goddess, from whom he is descended. As in other societies, animist beliefs began to become incorporated with the religions that entered from other regions. In the case of the Japanese, it was Buddhism. By the Asuka period, in the 500s, Buddhism had entered Japan from the mainland, spreading among the nobility. By the 700s, it had spread to the majority of the population. Since Buddhism and the Shinto beliefs weren't mutually exclusive, the two were integrated to create a mixed religion called Shinbutsu Shugo, meaning syncretism of kami and Buddhas. It remained Japan's only organized religion until the late modern period. The two most popular Buddhist schools in Japan were of the Mahayana branch. The Pure Land sect, which we discussed in our last episode, was popular among the general population, because it only stressed devotion, and that devotion alone leads to enlightenment. The aristocracy, instead, followed Zen Buddhism. It emphasized self-restraint, meditation, and was less concerned with doctrine and sutras. Zen Buddhism became popular with the samurai class during the feudal age. For practitioners of Zen, enlightenment could be achieved through satori, a sudden inexpressible feeling of inner understanding, for example while listening to distant bamboo sticks, or watching a beautiful event in nature. But many claimed enlightenment was only achieved through a rigorous regimen of zazen, meaning seated Zen. This is a long and arduous process of constant meditation, the complete cleansing of one's mind. While Japanese culture was initially influenced from the mainland, it never lost its own native elements. The early Japanese had no writing system of their own, but adopted the Chinese pictographic system early on. As the Japanese spoken language wasn't at all related to the Chinese family, that is, the Sino-Tibetan, they had to incorporate the Chinese characters in order to create a hybrid system, called kanji, which used borrowed Chinese characters with Japanese pronunciation. By the 800s, this writing style evolved to include hiragana and katakana. Early Japanese writers and members of the imperial court at first preferred to write their poetry and essays in classical Chinese, but by the Heian period and beyond, Chinese influence waned, and Japanese culture came into its own. By the feudal period, Japanese court officials also lost their influence, and written works, like poetry, came from non-public officials. These intellectuals attempted to mimic the feelings of Zen in their poetry, describing natural scenes, and setting relaxing or somber moods. The most popular form of poetry among the aristocracy was kanshi. The word means Han poetry, and remained popular during the end of the classical era. By the feudal age, a new type of poetry became highly regarded. It was short, and formed with exactly 17 syllables total, divided into lines of 5, 7, and 5. This was eventually called a haiku. Haikus generally have a kigo, a phrase that references the season, and a kireiji, a specific category of word used in traditional poetry. They do not have to end after 17 syllables, and can be linked with other haikus by other poets, a collaborative work called a renga. Poetry was also used as a means of communication. Upper-class women were usually separated from males early on, and took to writing poetry. They were only allowed to talk to men from behind screens, so this poetry was often their only means of courtship. By the feudal and more militarized Kamakura period, literature evolved and focused on more warlike subjects. Instead of refined or courtly heroes, novels instead were about more common people, dealing with the battles around them, or the adventures of warriors, the highs and lows of the symphony of war. A type of theater also developed, taking elements from native traditions and others brought in from China. It has its origins in the early feudal period, but became a distinctive form of theater by the 1300s. These were dance-based dramatic plays called no, and were based on traditional Japanese literature, and usually involved supernatural elements. Masks were regularly used to depict deities, demons, and women, as they were not permitted to be performers until modern times. It is the oldest major theater art still performed today. Classical Japanese architecture was influenced by both Buddhism and Chinese styles from the Tang. During the Heian period, as Japan distanced itself from China, it developed its own culture, called Kokufu. One of its architectural styles was called Shindanzukuri. It featured a wide open structure, with sudare, traditional blinds or screens, and shitomi, lattice folding doors, which are hinged horizontally. By the Muromachi period, a newer architecture developed, influenced by Zen Buddhism, called Shonzukuri. Shoin means drawing room, or study. This style replaced the hinged doors with sliding panels, called fusuma. Flooring material was made up of tatami, a kind of mat. These rooms were meant to be empty, with no ornaments, just hidden shelves. Guests would be invited for tea ceremonies here, as part of a Zen ritual. Outdoors, gardens were modeled after the Chinese, and emphasized streams or ponds. The Kinkakuji, or Golden Pavilion in Kyoto, demonstrates a perfect union of traditional building architecture, the surrounding gardens, and flow of water. As tea ceremonies were an indoor expression of Zen, it was expressed outdoors with the art of arranging flowers, and bonsai, the art of growing and maintaining miniature trees. As we discussed last episode, scroll paintings, called hand scrolls, were popular in China. In Japan, they were given their own style. Initially, nature was the dominant theme, but during the Warring States period, art became more narrative, telling stories of warriors or priests, full of detailed expression. Japanese sculpture also tended to depict their generals and deities, like the guardian kings, in more warlike fashion. Japan became a shining example of how a mix of cultures can be used as an asset. But they weren't the only ones. China was ancient, China was big, and it touched many. Just to the west of Japan was the second East Asian region in China's sphere. We now travel to Korea. The Korean peninsula, like China and Japan, was mountainous, and only around 20% was available for farming. Farming itself was probably not introduced until around 2000 BCE, although hunting and gathering were still the preferred method of survival. Though not all academics agree, Korean scholars claim that the first major kingdom in Korea was the ancient Joseon, or Gojoseon. It was reportedly founded in 2333 BCE by Tangun, the grandson of Heaven and son of a bear. Like Emperor Jimmu of Japan, it's possible the story of Tangun could have been based on a more historical chieftain or warrior. He is credited with bringing in the Bronze Age and the beginnings of centralization and development. Archaeological evidence for the formation of Gojoseon seems to point to a more recent time frame, around 700 BCE onwards, as an Iron Age society based around town alliances near the Taedong and Liao River basins. Further rulers and dynasties of Gojoseon remain debated, but less disputed are the events around 108 BCE, when the northern regions came under the influence of the Han dynasty, which put an end to the Gojoseon kingdom. This began a period of decentralization and warring states, similar to that of China. The Han had established 4 commanderies in the region, but 3 of these fell to Korean resistance. The Han fell in 220, as we had discussed in our Ancient World video, and the last commandery was destroyed by 313. In time, 3 main kingdoms emerged as hegemonic powers on the peninsula. Goryeo was in the north, Baekje in the southwest, and Shilla in the southeast. This was the 3 kingdoms period in Korea. Though they were each founded earlier, they reached their peak during the 3 to 600s. Goryeo in the north, with its capital at Pyongyang, became the first to adopt Buddhism by the 300s. It prospered under Kwangeto the Great. Shilla, nestled to the southeast, was not as immersed in the Chinese sphere, but as they were threatened by the massive Goryeo, they allied themselves, first with Baekje, an alliance that was broken, and then with Tang China. At the hands of the Tang and Shilla alliance, Baekje and Goryeo were defeated by 668, but then, conflict erupted between the Chinese and Korean allies. By 676, the war ended, and the Tang kept much of the former Goryeo territory north of the peninsula, but Shilla had expelled the Chinese and took control of Korea up to the Taedong River. Needing to govern this newly unified state, the Shilla adopted many of the systems of centralized government based on the Chinese. Buddhism, which came to Korea in the 300s, reaching Shilla by the 500s, flourished once again and became the state religion. At the capital of Gyeongju, art and architecture began to resemble the Chinese model as well, and written Chinese became the official written language. The aristocracy, though, were wary of the civil service examinations and prevented their adoption, along with other reforms to help the lower classes. Not long after Shilla was unified, another entity emerged to the north, in much of the former Goryeo territory, marking the northern and southern period. This was to be called the Balhae Kingdom. It was a multi-ethnic kingdom, mostly situated north of the peninsula, and composed of former Goryeo peoples, and the Moha. These were a Tungusic people, native to Siberia and Northeast Asia, and some could have been ancestors to the Jurchen, and later Manchu. There remains controversy over the kingdom, as Korean scholars consider it predominantly Korean, like Shilla to the south, while China believes it was predominantly Moha, but under Tang rule. Russian scholars claim it was a Moha state, but independent of Korea and China. Whichever the case, Balhae was conquered in 926 by the Liao Empire of the Khitan. Shilla had difficulties of its own, as regional conflicts broke out in the former Baekje and Goryeo territories, leading to another period of disunity called the Later Three Kingdoms, beginning in 889. Shilla had been in decline long prior to this, as policies that only favored the king led to resentment among the aristocracy, the landowners, and peasants. Shilla began to lose territory and became the weakest of the 3 kingdoms. One of these kingdoms, later Goryeo, managed to defeat its rivals by 936, and even absorbed parts of the Balhae to the north. The new kingdom was named Goryeo, after its predecessor, and it was to be the first true unification of the entire Korean peninsula, and the start of stable dynastic rule for centuries. It not only unified the Goryeo, Baekje and Shilla, but also the ruling classes of the Balhae in the north. It was from this kingdom that the modern name of Korea was born. The Goryeo state implemented the civil service examinations in 958, although it did little to change the makeup of the governmental bureaucracy. Agriculture remained the main industry, and while all lands were owned by the king, they were run by local nobles. Like in other medieval societies, the farms were worked by the peasant classes. Below peasants on the social ladder were chonmin, or vulgar commoners. These were made up of nobi, slaves which were used to serve the yangban, or aristocracy, and the baekjong, or untouchables. These were those who worked professions that were deemed unclean, such as butchers, shaman, magicians, and prostitutes. The Goryeo era was considered a golden age for Buddhism. Pure Land and Zen Buddhism both became popular, and came to control large tracts of land. The Goryeo Tripitaka, the sacred collection of Buddhist scripture, was carved into woodblock in the 1200s. It is the oldest intact version of Buddhist canon in Hanja script, the Korean writing system that uses Chinese characters. Though relatively small, Goryeo was often entangled in conflict with both the Khitan and Jurchen tribes to their west. But by the mid-1200s, it was the Mongols who successfully achieved victory in Korea, after years of attempts. Though the Goryeo were reduced to a tributary state to the Yuan for 80 years, they were noted for putting up more resistance than most of the other regions the Mongols had conquered, and remained semi-autonomous. The invasions brought untold destruction to Goryeo. The Hwangryongsa, an enormous Buddhist temple built 600 years earlier, was destroyed, along with the first version of the Goryeo Tripitaka. As the Mongol leader, Kublai Khan, set his sights on Japan next, he forced peasants and artisans to build the invasion fleet. Though the state of Goryeo continued to exist, unlike the southern Song in China, the ruling class was forced into marriages with the Mongol leaders and their families. Once the Yuan began to decline in the mid-1300s, Goryeo fought to fend off the Red Turban rebellions which had originated in China, and pirates called the Wuko, vicious seafarers from Japan. Korea attempted to expand further and even proposed the ambitious act of invading Ming China. But in 1392, the general Yi Seung-ye overthrew the Goryeo dynasty in a coup. He founded a new state, called Joseon, and moved the capital to Hansung, present-day Seoul. Confucianism was adopted as the state ideology, resulting in the loss of power and wealth for Buddhist temples. Among the Sunbi, or scholar class, Neo-Confucianism became prominent. This class only grew, as this was a golden age for Korean academics and sciences. There were advances in printing, astronomy, military technology, medicine, and agriculture. One of the oldest surviving world maps from East Asia comes from here, called the Kangnido. It depicts an early representation of the Old World. The most notable ruler during the Joseon was Sejong the Great, who is responsible for creating Hangul, the Korean alphabet. He is regarded as one of the greatest rulers in Korean history. And as we leave the Joseon, which will continue to exist for another 500 years, we head to a land to the south, another region which had its own struggles with China. This is Vietnam. We've touched on southern Vietnam and the rest of Southeast Asia in an earlier episode. Today, we will focus on the north, as it was less involved with Indian culture, and more in the Chinese sphere of influence. This region had been occupied since the Paleolithic, and by around 1000 BCE, the first complex culture appeared, called the Dongsong, or Lark Viet. They appear to have been expert bronze casters, creating the Dongsong drums, which are found widely throughout the region. Like Korea and Japan, Vietnam also has a semi-legendary early kingdom from which it claims descent. It was called the Hung Bang dynasty, said to have been founded from 2879 BCE, but like Gojoseon, there is no evidence for such an early date. It's more likely the creation of the Vietnamese state wasn't so early, or so large. It could have developed around 700 BCE or later, in northern Vietnam, from the Lac Viet, a conglomeration of Kra-Dai and Austroasiatic tribes. The kingdom itself was called Van Lang, and was the first historical Vietnamese state. Further north, the Viet were a confederation of Bio tribes, but in 258 BCE, Tuc Phan invaded the Lac Viet and created a newer and larger kingdom, called a Lac, consolidating the Lac Viet and Viet tribes. The Baiua were a conglomeration of many different tribes living all over southern China and the Red River Delta at this time. They were composed of Austroasiatics, Kra-Dai, Hmong, and others. The Chinese just used this name to group them all as non-Han. The Qin dynasty of China conducted expansion campaigns to the south to subdue the Yue, but after the Qin fell, a Chinese general named Zhao Tuo declared independence in 204 BCE, creating the kingdom of Nanyue. But once the Han Empire emerged, they embarked on expansion campaigns of their own, first making Nanyue a tribute state, and then fully conquering and annexing it in 111 BCE. This would become the first of 4 periods of northern domination in Vietnamese history. Rule under the Chinese was oppressive, and wheels of rebellion soon started to turn. An armed civil uprising began in 40 CE, led by Trung Trac and her sister, Trung Ni. The Trung sisters were initially successful and ruled China for 3 years before the Han armies regrouped and suppressed the rebellion. The Trung sisters were either killed or committed suicide. This led to the second and third period of northern domination, separated by the short-lived empire of Van Xian. Apart from this, Vietnam was continuously under the Chinese heel for 1,000 years. Because of the strong sense of nationality among the Vietnamese, the Chinese were forced to rule more directly. Aristocrats began to intermarry, and a new class of Sino-Vietnamese emerged. Chinese culture was slowly brought in, through the arts, literature, writing system, and Confucianism, as China tried to assimilate the Vietnamese population. Despite the cultural integration, the Vietnamese longed for sovereignty, and once the powerful Tang dynasty of China collapsed in the early 900s, the Vietnamese became more autonomous. After a period of civil war, Vietnam became fully independent and established their own kingdom in 968, called Dai Viet. The name Dai Viet means Great Viet, and reflects the ambition of the new dynasty to consolidate and expand the territory of Vietnam. As China had ruled over the region for such a long time, it was only natural that the rulers of Dai Viet integrate some of the Chinese model in their administration. As they were a river valley society, they needed stricter and more centralized government. Dai Viet succeeded more than Japan in their centralized governmental model. The king remained powerful, and the aristocratic classes held less power. Religion was initially based on earlier Vietnamese folk religion, called Duo Long. Over time though, with the influence of the Chinese, Buddhism, Confucianism and Taoism became more popular. Art and architecture was also greatly influenced by China. Some of the early historic constructions of the Dai Viet, like the one-pillar pagoda, were based on Chinese styles. As in Japan and Korea, Vietnam wasn't bound by the traditions of its northern neighbor, and derived their own style. Though they used Chinese characters, they would adapt them to create a writing system for their own language, called Chunom. Similarly to China, those aiming for governmental positions could be from any class, just as long as they were male, and would write the civil service examinations. The test was based on Confucian classics, as well as traditional Vietnamese stories. The life of the average Vietnamese peasant was different to that of Japan. Large private farms or properties were rare, as a means to keep the landed nobles in check. Most farmers owned their own small piece of land, or rented from another small farmer. Family life was also similar to China, but despite the Confucian hierarchies, women were more valued. They were able to initiate divorces, and had the same property rights as men. Though Chinese domination subverted this to some extent, women were always viewed as more equal to men from a labor and legal standpoint, compared to China. The ancient Vietnamese society was most likely matrilineal, and as the old adage goes, when the enemy is at the gate, the woman goes out fighting. Over the next many centuries, Dai Viet was engaged in numerous wars and conflicts, mostly from the north. On numerous occasions, the Mongols attempted to conquer both Dai Viet and Champa to the south, but the Vietnamese use of scorched earth was the perfect counter to the Mongolian armies. The decisive battle was fought on water, with General Tran Hung Dao predicting the enemy's movement and setting up booby traps for the Yuan ships. After losing the battle, Kublai Khan gave up his invasion of Southeast Asia. And it fittingly ended on the same river from where the Vietnamese gained independence from China over 3 centuries earlier. The Vietnamese came under the fourth and final period of northern domination in 1407, this time under the Ming. But unlike the previous eras, which lasted 1,000 years, Vietnam was free by 1427, just 20 years later. As population increased over the years, Dai Viet would have to expand southwards, to the territory of Champa. Champa was a state set up in 192, and was more in the Indian sphere of influence than the Chinese. Check out our previous video to see more of the Southeast Asian states. By 1471, Dai Viet went on to conquer Champa in the Cham-Vietnamese War, unifying most of the coastline which makes up the present-day country of Vietnam. With their freedom from Chinese rule, came an even greater sense of unity, which would carry Dai Viet well into the early modern age, and beyond.